Well, the oldest one was a girl, and her name was Mabel LaFawn Kershaw. Uh, then I come next, George J. Kershaw, 2 years later. She was born on November the 9th, and I was born nearly 2 years later on September the 28th. Then 2 years later came Larry Morton Kershaw, and he was born on September 18th in 1933. But in the house, we had one bedroom, which was for our parents, and we had the living room, and my parents bought what they called a divan. It was like a couch, like goes in here, but you could fold it out and make a bed out of it. And then we had a back room that was called the junk room, and they cleared one side off of that and they put a single bed in that. So sleeping arrangements were, my brother Larry and I slept on the divan. Every night we laid the bed down, my mother made our bed. We slept. The next morning, my mother gathered all the quilts and everything up and folded the divan back up. Then it was the living room for the day. My sister, she slept in a single bed in the junk room. I slept in a bed out in the granary because there wasn't room for him in the house. And we kept that house that way until the year 1949. And my dad remodeled our home. He put an addition out on the front of it, an extra bedroom, which Larry and I slept in. By that time, LaFawn was married and she was gone.
So High finally got in.
Pardon?
So did High get into the house then?
No, he was gone long before that. He graduated from high school. I don't remember now what year that was, but the year he graduated from high school, and I remember well the day, he wanted to go to the University of Idaho and he had to have the money to do it. Our family didn't have the money to put him through school, so if he went to college, he had to do it on his own. He decided he would go to Yellowstone Park and go to work at one of the centers up there, like Old Faithful or Canyon, Mammoth Springs, some of those. And we had a milk truck that come there every morning and picked up their milk, and it would drive back towards Rigby. So High climbed up on the back of that truck and sat on a milk can and drove away. That's when he left our home. And that would have been in about 1938. And he went up and hitchhiked up through the Yellowstone Park. Finally ended up in Mammoth Hot Springs, working in a hotel up there, washing pots and pans. We took a trip that summer and went up and saw him. But he went up to the University of Idaho and he got 2 years in up there when World War II broke out. And so he knew he had to go in the service, and so he joined the Army and went into at that time it was the Army Air Force. There was no Air Force as we know it today. It was the Army Air Force. He wanted to be a pilot, and he was very short. I think the limit, it was they had to be 5 foot, 5'6" to become a pilot. And he measured 5'5". And so when he went through the physical and the guy wrote his height down as 5'9", when the guy turned his back, he went over and he erased that and put 5.6. And so they let him in and he became a fighter pilot. He eventually served in World War II over in Italy. He was on his way to the South Pacific to invade Japan when Japan gave up. But he went back to school. He finished his school at the University of Idaho, and then he went to veterinary school, and he became a doctor of veterinary medicine and practiced that throughout his life, the rest of his life. He stayed with the Army Air Corps when they made it to U.S. Air Force. He then remained there on the reserve, and he eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. So he made a lot for himself out of someone that was abused fiercely when he was born and grew up. He almost grew up in no man's land. It wasn't until he got married that they were going to get married in the Logan Temple. My father asked him who he would like to be sealed to, his mother, or he says, "We will have you sealed to us if that's what you desire." So he decided to be sealed to my mother and father, and so we became legitimate brothers and sisters as far as our Father in heaven is concerned. We've always loved him, and we included him in everything that we possibly could. LaFawn, she was 1 year ahead of me in school. And when we got into high school, because of the World War II, there was not sufficient teachers. They were all in the service. And so we were very limited in the vocational studies that we had the first 2 years. Of course, they got a band teacher, and we decided we wanted to be in the band. And so in my sophomore year in high school, I played the trumpet. My sister played the saxophone, so we played together in the band. We played in the pep band, and I didn't ever become Louis Armstrong, but I was able to play good enough to stay in the band. I played in the band my sophomore and junior year. My senior year, I had to choose between band and graduating from seminary, and so I chose seminary. So I dropped out of the band, and LaFawn, she went on and she graduated in 1948, but she met a young man that had just come out of the service named Eugene Andrews. And they became engaged before she graduated from high school. She graduated from high school in May. They were married in June. She had, I think, 6 children. And the first one was Lynette, and that was my mother's. I had to lie. That was the baby that she never was able to have, and so that was a choice to hers. LaFawn grew up and raised a good family. Her and her husband went on a mission down to the Mexico. They learned to speak Spanish. They went on a temple mission down to the Mexico City Temple, and they have a 10-acre parcel. They called it the 10-acre farm. They grew raspberries, strawberries, garden, till it was too hard for them to do. My sister is now 83 years old. She'll soon be 84 years old. Her health is not too good, but never know how long we'll all live in this. My brother Larry, he was 2 years behind me. And so when I graduated from high school, he was then coming in as a sophomore in high school. No, he was coming in as a junior. But in my senior year, the high school burned down. That was always a dream of a kid, to have your school burned down. My dad, we'd been out dating the night before, and my dad come in. He says, Midway High School's on fire. Do you want to go down and see it? I'll let it burn. So we struggled through that, but that ended that high school. They closed it after that year, made it some kind of a junior high school or something out of it. But then they transferred all the high school kids to Rigby. So Larry went and graduated from Rigby High School. But he and I grew up almost together. I was a little bit smaller for my age, and so we were about the same size. But we used to have our fights, and one time I'd win, the next time he'd win. But we did a lot of work out in the farm together. We did a lot of irrigating together. We whatever farm work there was, he took his spot at milking cows, and my dad eventually bought a milking machine, and when he bought the milking machine, he retired as a milkmaid, and so he left the milking to Larry and I. We had to milk the cows after that. He would give us a reprieve on Sunday morning. He'd let us sleep in on Sunday morning. He milked the cows then. But Larry and I, after we got up and we got on where we would date and so forth, we were almost like, friends. We would double dated together. We went to youth dances together. And after I graduated, I went to Rick's College, but then he had to milk the cows. And after that, I didn't have to milk the cows much anymore because I never was home very much after that. But he liked the farm. He didn't like the mechanical end of it. He didn't like to drive the tractor. The only thing he liked to do was deal with horses and cows. He was very, very much a farm boy that way.
Was there much of a social aspect when you're working, if you're working that closely with Larry out on the farm? I think it's hard for some people to picture what that's really like. Are you working close enough that you can have sort of conversation?
Oh, yes. What
kind of things would you talk about?
Oh, what we was going to do Saturday night and what was we going to do today. Just normal.
But you had running jokes together and stuff.
Oh yeah, we used to. I was a little quicker on the think than Larry. And if there was a certain amount of work to do, I could think away, and I got the better part of it a lot of time. Disgrace now, I guess, but that's the way it worked. We kind of divided up the farm, and we was assigned different aspects of it. We had 4 fields of potatoes that we grew. It's my job to irrigate these 2 fields. It was his job to irrigate these 2 fields. We took turns watering the hay, irrigating the grain. That was a lot of work in the summertime, was that type of thing. He didn't like the horses, and I liked the tractor. So after we got the tractor, I took over all the tractor work, cultivating the potatoes and taking care of all of the potatoes on the farm for about 5 or 6 years. That was my job. But there's a picture out there of my dad digging potatoes with the tractor after I was on my mission, but that was typical of the way we worked out in the field. So I don't remember that we ever did pick potatoes together. You'd pick in partners. You'd have a potato basket. Each one of you would fill a basket, and you dump it into a sack. And LaFawn and I picked together for a lot of years. Larry, he had another friend that picked with him, and so we just worked that way until I got big enough to where I could lift the sacks of potatoes, and then I was graduated to bucking them sacks up onto a wagon. My back today is suffering from a lot of those types of things. On a critical number, we actually had 78 acres. That was total acres in the farm. But when we first moved onto the farm, in the early years they had a lot of floods because they didn't have control of the rivers then, and so floods would come down through there, and they'd cut channels. We call them sloughs, swales, and so our farm was broke up into a lot of different parcels because of that. But acreage-wise, we would generally try to raise out of that 78 acres. We would generally, it could vary a little bit because of the shapes of the fields and so forth, but my dad always tried to raise 20 acres of potatoes. He generally had about from 15 to 20 acres of grain, and he had 15 to 20 acres of hay. I don't know how to quantify that to you. Our farm was a quarter of a mile wide and a half a mile deep. That's the way they broke up the farming ground. So if you can quantify it from that. And then each one of that inside the farm then was broken up into fields, and wherever the water was, you could get the water to run. When we first moved there, that was the big problem. But my dad spent a lot of time. They had what they called a miskin scraper, and it was a scraper that you could go along and scoop it up into a kind of a bin, and he'd drive 4 head of horses on that, and he spent a lot of springs out there, and he would take the high spots off and fill in the lower spots so they could water with fewer ditches. But we still had swales that we had to deal with. That's dips. You'd run the tomatoes or potatoes down from one end, and then you'd irrigate part of from one end, and you'd run the water down with we call it a levee, and over the top, and run a ditch out, then water it back down to the hollow. But we always saved all of our grain. We never sold any of the grain. It was always put in a granary. We never sold the hay. The hay, we always mowed it with a team of horses and a mower. And then we would rake it into bunches, and then we'd pitch that onto a wagon, bring it into the yard when it got dry, and then we had a derrick and we would stack it. So consequently, the potatoes was the only what we would term as mutually off of the farm was a cash crop. So the 20 acres of potatoes, you'd put them in the cellar, and then when you got it was like a gamble on the stock market. When you felt like you got about as good a price as you could get, then you'd sell it to a potato warehouse. And they would come in, and to begin with, they would sort the potatoes right on the farm and put them into 100-pound bags. They'd sort them out, number ones, number twos, and then the culls they left there. So they would haul them into Louisville and put them on a railroad car and ship them back east or wherever they wanted them. So that's how you got rid of those. We sold them to a potato processing warehouse. The others, the hay and the grain, we had a variety of animals on the farm, and so we had to feed them through the winter. It was cold winters in Idaho, and so you always hoped you had enough hay to feed, and you had to keep the amount of livestock that you had enough feed to feed them through the winter. So you had one aspect of cows. We had to feed the cows, and we had to feed them some of the grain to keep them going. So you'd feed the cows the hay and the grain, and then you'd milk them. Then we always sold the milk to a cooperative. And we put them in 10-gallon cans, and they'd come and pick up those 10-gallon cans every morning, haul them into Idaho Falls. We sold it to Challenge, and they would make butter, or they would make cheese out of it. And then that way we had what we called a cash flow to keep the family afloat. So my mother would get a milk check every 2 weeks. That's what she would use partly to take care of the family. My dad never did care much about shopping and whatnot, but she would take that money and she would go to the grocery store once a week and she would buy the supply of groceries what we needed. Of course, we grew a lot of our own food on the farm. We had our own potatoes. We always had fattened up a beef, and we always had a beef that we killed in the wintertime. We had pigs, so we'd kill pigs and we'd have ham, bacon, we'd have pork chops, everything that from the pigs. And for a number of years in my early youth, till somewhere towards the end of World War II, we had a herd of sheep. We had 150 head of female ewe sheep. And so part of the hay that we grew during the summer went to feed the sheep. Well, the sheep produced us 2 cash crops. We'd always, of course, breed the ewes in the fall, and then in March, where they would have their lambs. And so we would lamb out the lambs and the sheep, and then we would join what we called a community herd. There was a number of farmers around there would have a small herd of sheep, and we would always found somebody that had a range right up in the mountains. And so they would combine and make at least what they called one band of sheep, which is 1,000 head of sheep. And so we would send the lambs and the ewes, we would send them out into the mountains. But long in May, when it warmed up, then we would have to shear the wool off of the adult sheep. So we'd have to go out and spend a week or 10 days out on the sheep, wherever they were camped. They'd have a corral, and we'd hire shearers to come in, and they would shear the sheep and put it in great big bags, and then you sold that to a cooperative, and that was another cash crop. Then in the early fall, generally in September, when the feed in the mountains would start to dry up, then you'd go up and separate out the lambs. The lambs that had grown sufficiently and weighed 100 pounds, they were loaded onto trucks and sent to a slaughterhouse. And then you sold the lamb through a buyer and this type of thing. So that was the second cash crop there. Then another one was we always had chickens. My mother, that was her project on the farm. She always had 150 Leghorn laying chickens that she kept around, and so she gathered the eggs every day, and as time went on, you'd have to clean them all up and make sure they were good. And they had a potato basket full of eggs sitting around, so we'd all sit down, and if they were really crappy, dirty, well, we'd have to wash them all off and make sure they were clean, or you'd sand some of it off with a little sander, and and you would crate them up. And part of the time, my mother would take that crate of eggs to a grocery store and trade them out for groceries. Another time we sold them to a cooperative, a co-op. And they would come and get them once a week, and then they would bring us the check from the week before. We'd buy the laying mash and so forth. But then that was another source of income that my mother used too. She paid all the utility bills and the groceries that we needed. Well, she'd buy them because we always supplied all of our own meat and our eggs. We got butter from the creamery. We had maybe I said that, but we always had our own potatoes and everything. My mother always canned all summer long. She would can, and that took care of the other part. So together, I never missed a meal. In all the time that I was growing up, I never knew a time that we were hungry or there wasn't food to eat. And that's what used up the farm. You took the cash crop of potatoes, generally to begin with, that paid off the farm, and then you had to repair the machinery, and you had to buy new machinery, replace machinery, buy the new machinery as it come on that you had to do. So you always used the cash crop money to purchase those types of items. So it was a balancing act. My dad would always go to the bank every spring and take out small loans to operate the farm on through, and then when he sold the potatoes and so forth, he'd go back in and pay all of that off. So that's how you divvied up the farm as to which direction it went.